The Type U-9 class submarines, including U-9 itself, featured a double-hull design. This significantly improved buoyancy control and endurance during coastal operations. It was a real step forward compared to earlier models like U-5. The overall length of the boat was 188 feet, while the pressure hull measured 157 feet. It had a beam of 20 feet, a height of 23 feet, and a draft of 10 feet. Thanks to these compact dimensions, the U-boat could easily maneuver in shallow water while maintaining enough room for the crew and equipment. Surface displacement was 543 tons, and submerged displacement was 674 tons. This reflected increased structural strength thanks to a wider hull compared to its predecessors. Propulsion came from a gasoline-electric system, a real innovation for the era. It consisted of 4 cording kerosene engines producing 1,000 horsepower on the surface and 2 Siemens Schuckert electric motors generating 1,160 horsepower for submerged travel. These drove 4 shafts with propellers almost 5 feet in diameter. This setup delivered a surface speed of 14 knots and a submerged speed of 8 knots. Range was 3,300 nautical miles at a surface speed of 9 knots and 80 nautical miles at a submerged speed of 5 knots. Diving depth reached 164 feet. These specs showed that the U-boat was built for short, hard-hitting combat missions rather than long transoceanic crossings. The crew consisted of 4 officers and 25 to 31 sailors. Everyone was packed into extremely cramped compartments, which was typical of early submarine construction. At the time of commissioning, the arsenal featured 4 18-inch torpedo tubes, 2 in the bow and 2 in the stern, along with a payload of 6 torpedoes. Deck guns were not installed initially. Construction and launching. Construction of the German U-boat U-9 was ordered on July 15, 1908. This was part of a massive expansion program for the Kaiserliche Marine, the German Imperial Navy, right on the eve of the First World War. The primary goal was to strengthen coastal defense amid the naval arms race between Germany and Great Britain. This move reflected Germany's growing interest in submarine technology. The country was shifting from experimental designs to building fully fledged warships to patrol the North and Baltic Seas. U-9 became the lead boat of the Type U-9 class, which included 4 submarines, from U-9 to U-12. All of these were intended primarily for coastal operations. The boat was built at the Imperial Shipyard in Danzig, one of the main hubs of German shipbuilding. U-9 had its keel laid down in an atmosphere of a frantic industrial boom as shipyards ramped up production to meet the goals of the 1908 Naval Law. The compact design of the Type U-9 class made both construction and operation as efficient as possible. Drawing on experience gained from the U-5 class boats, engineers successfully implemented a double hull structure and an improved propulsion system. While the exact date the keel was laid down has not survived in the archives, the process ran strictly according to the schedule of imperial directives of the early 20th century. U-9 was launched on February 22, 1910, during a formal ceremony. This highlighted the German command's belief that submarine warfare could become a strategic advantage. The first post-launch trials took place in the Baltic Sea near Danzig. Their goal was to check hull integrity and basic seaworthiness before moving on to more serious tests. After fitting the weapons and engines, the U-boat was officially commissioned on April 18, 1910. This marked the end of the construction phase and the beginning of its service in the submarine flotilla. Early service and World War I participation, the pre-war years. The submarine U-9 joined the Imperial German Navy on April 18, 1910. It was built at the Danzig shipyard. It was the first boat of its class, designed for coastal defense and short cruises in the open sea. Following its commissioning, extensive trials began. The crew tested the engines, the ability to submerge, and overall seaworthiness. Most of the early tests took place in the calm waters of the Baltic Sea. The sailors were getting accustomed to the gasoline and electric engines as well as the double hull. This design made the U-boat more stable and allowed it to carry more batteries compared to earlier models. The first commander of U-9 was Captain Lieutenant Valdemar Kofemel. On September 27, 1910, the U-boat was assigned to a newly formed flotilla. Germany was actively building up its submarine force for coastal defense. Cofemel already had experience serving on earlier models like U-2. He focused on training in the Baltic Sea, practicing submerged maneuvers and torpedo operations. On October 1, 1911, Captain Lieutenant Otto Weddigen took command. He continued his predecessor's work. A year later, following a fleet reorganization, U-9 was transferred to the 1st Submarine Half Flotilla for regular patrols and tactical drills off the northern coast of Germany. Pre-war training became more intense. The crew of U-9 practiced tactics for attacking surface ships, ambushes, and evasive maneuvers. The Imperial Navy aimed to transform submarines from experimental prototypes into a genuine fighting force. A historic event took place on July 16, 1914. For the first time in submarine history, the crew of U-9 successfully reloaded their torpedo tubes while completely submerged. This proved the boat was ready for actual combat, as spare torpedoes were stored inside, allowing for sustained underwater engagements. This test under Weddigen's command demonstrated that on the eve of the war, U-9 had become a truly formidable weapon. First combat patrols in command. Captain Lieutenant Otto Weddigen, who had commanded U-9 since October 1, 1911, led the boat into battle. He possessed extensive experience in submarine operations gained through his years of service in the Imperial German Navy's submarine fleet. His previous service had focused on tactical maneuvers and stealth. This helped the crew operate at maximum efficiency right from the start of the war. On August 1, 1914, U-9 became part of the 1st Flotilla. This group was tasked with conducting offensive patrols in the North Sea to challenge the dominance of the British fleet and support Germany's overall naval strategy. Consequently, the U-boat began carrying out aggressive reconnaissance missions. It probed enemy positions, even though there were still certain restrictions on combat operations at the time. In August and September of 1914, fierce debates were taking place within the German High Command over exactly how to employ submarines. This also impacted the initial patrols of U-9. The military, specifically Flotilla Commander Corvette Captain Herman Bauer, advocated for unrestricted attacks on British merchant ships. This was their proposed method to break the Royal Navy blockade. However, Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg and Foreign Minister Gottlieb von Jagow warned against violating international rules of naval warfare. They feared damaging relations with neutral countries, particularly the United States of America. Due to these disagreements, the U-boats focused on reconnaissance and selective attacks on warships rather than on mass destruction of the merchant fleet. Crews were ordered to surface to inspect merchant vessels. This was extremely dangerous and went against the fundamental nature of submarine warfare. On September 20, 1914, U-9 set out on its first combat patrol. At 5:15 in the morning, under Weddigen's command, the U-boat left Heligoland and headed for a waiting position near the West Hinder lightship off the coast of the Netherlands. The route passed through the Heligoland Bight. At 5:30 in the morning, the crew performed a test dive near the Hogston lightship. They continued southwest, but due to strong northwest winds and heavy seas, they had to reduce speed. The bad weather severely limited visibility and maneuverability. During its first reconnaissance in the North Sea, the U-boat sailed along the coast, navigating by the Ameland and Imuden lighthouses. Because of the storm, the compass was inaccurate, and Weddigen had to constantly correct their course. The main goal was to take up a good position for an ambush. At dusk, the U-boat submerged and ran on its electric motors to avoid enemy patrols. At night, to keep from being detected during the storm, they lay on the seabed. At first, the crew hardly encountered any enemies. On September 22nd, they spotted a darkened vessel at a distance of over 3,280 feet. The appearance of suspicious ships forced them to dive to a depth of 50 to 80 feet. This allowed U-9 to remain undetected and prepare for actual attacks. The crew had practiced their quick response skills during pre-war exercises. On July 16, 1914, U-9 carried out a historic underwater torpedo reload, which proved useful in real combat conditions. Key battles of 1914. On September 22, 1914, submarine U-9, commanded by Otto Weddigen, achieved one of the most significant early successes of submarine warfare by sinking 3 British armored cruisers. These were HMS Aboukir, HMS Hogue, and HMS Cressy, located in the North Sea off the Dutch coast. Approaching on the surface undetected, because the cruisers were sailing in a predictable line at low speed without destroyer escorts, U-9 submerged. It fired a single torpedo that struck Aboukir amidships at around 6:30 in the morning. The hit caused the ship to capsize and sink within 15 minutes, resulting in the loss of 527 lives. Taking advantage of British formation errors, Hogue and Cressy halted to rescue survivors, which turned them into stationary targets. U-9 then launched torpedoes at Hogue, sinking her in minutes with 424 fatalities. This was followed by strikes on Cressy, which went down after 15 minutes with 508 deaths. In total, there were 1,459 casualties across the 3 12,000-ton vessels. The battle lasted just over an hour. U-9 used periscope observations for targeting while submerged to stay hidden. After firing 2 torpedoes at Hogue, the submarine briefly broke the surface due to trim issues before diving again. However, there was no intentional resurfacing to reload, as the crew used their initial loadout of 6 18-inch torpedoes. This action showed how vulnerable unescorted surface patrols were to underwater ambushes. The British decision to stop and lower rescue boats without taking evasive maneuvers or dropping depth charges allowed U-9 to maneuver freely underwater. Less than a month later, on October 15, 1914, U-9 struck again in the North Sea. It torpedoed the armored cruiser HMS Hawke while the ship was patrolling with a northbound convoy off Aberdeen. Weddigen's submerged submarine used periscope sightings to fire a single torpedo. It hit Hawke on her port side, causing the 7,350-ton vessel to sink rapidly. 524 crew members were lost out of the 834 aboard. This attack further highlighted the tactical skill of U-Boat 9 in exploiting convoy formations. Hawke had detached slightly from the group, presenting an isolated target without immediate anti-submarine support. These engagements resulted in over 43,000 tons of British warships sunk. They showcased innovative submarine tactics such as periscope-directed submerged approaches and opportunistic strikes on enemy mistakes. This far exceeded previous successes, like when submarine U-Boat 21 sank HMS Pathfinder. Immediately after, Weddigen and his crew received the Iron Cross from Kaiser Wilhelm II for the September action. Weddigen was later awarded the Pour le Mérite for sinking the Hawke, elevating U-Boat 9 to a symbol of German naval ingenuity. These losses caused a swift shift in British anti-submarine doctrine. Admiral John Jellicoe issued warnings against stopping for rescues without defensive screens, and the Grand Fleet was relocated to Scapa Flow to reduce submarine threats in coastal waters. Later war service. On January 12, 1915, command of U-Boat 9 passed to Johannes Spies. He led the submarine on additional patrols that primarily targeted merchant shipping in the North Sea. Under his command, U-Boat 9 conducted 5 more war patrols through 1915. The submarine sank 13 merchant vessels, totaling 8,636 gross register tons. These included steamers and fishing trawlers. They strictly followed prize rules by surfacing to inspect the ships first. In July 1915, U-Boat 9 was reassigned to the Baltic Flotilla for operations in more confined waters. By April 1916, due to her age and the demands of newer submarines, she was withdrawn from frontline combat. The boat was transferred to Kiel for training duties, where it served as an instructional vessel for new submarine crews until the end of the war. U-Boat 9 survived the conflict intact and was surrendered to the Allies on November 26, 1918, as part of the armistice terms. It was later scrapped at Morecambe, England in 1919. Later operations and withdrawal. Command changes in Baltic service. After the successful campaigns of late 1914, command of the submarine U-Boat 9 passed to Johannes Spies on January 12, 1915. Spies already knew the vessel well, having served as its first watch officer under Otto Weddigen during early patrols in the North Sea. In July 1915, U-boat 9 was reassigned to the Baltic Flotilla, where it stayed until April 1916. Its mission shifted from hunting merchant ships in the North Sea to defending German naval forces against the Russian Baltic Fleet. The crew monitored Russian naval movements in the Gulf of Finland and protected German coastal waters. This meant working closely with surface ships in the narrow, heavily contested waters of the Baltic theater. Under the command of Spies, U-boat 9 sank 13 merchant ships totaling 8,635 tons, as well as the Russian warship Dago, which displaced 1,080 tons. During her time in the Baltic, she sank the British steamer Serbino on August 16, 1915, and the Dago on November 5th. These attacks targeted Allied shipping routes and disrupted supply lines, even though the aging design of U-boat 9 severely limited how long she could stay at sea. Operating in the Baltic was tough. Both sides had laid dense minefields. Severe weather made underwater maneuvers difficult, and coordinating between submarines and surface fleets was a constant struggle. Despite this, high expectations rested on the crew. U-boat 9 had built a legendary reputation from its early 1914 victories. It was even awarded the Iron Cross directly by Kaiser Wilhelm II, making it one of only 2 Imperial German vessels to receive this rare honor. Training role and the end of the war. By April 1916, multiple patrols had taken their toll. U-9 was worn out, and her early coastal design was obsolete compared to the larger, more capable submarine classes entering the war. As a result, she was withdrawn from frontline service. The Navy briefly transferred her back to the Baltic to test her as a mine layer, installing 2 mine-laying rails in 1916. However, the modifications failed and were quickly removed. From April 20, 1916, until the armistice on November 11, 1918, U-9 was assigned to the training flotilla in Kiel. She spent the rest of the war teaching new crews the basics of submarine operations. Instructors used her to give sailors practical experience in handling the boat, performing dives, and practicing torpedo tactics. These drills took place in the safer waters around Kiel, allowing recruits to run mock combat scenarios without the danger of real battle. Recruits practiced endurance dives and coordinated attacks against target ships, building the skills they would need on the front lines. Johannes Spies was her last true combat commander, stepping down on April 19, 1916. After that, no dedicated captains were appointed. Instead, flotilla instructors and support staff took over command duties. When the war ended, the crew joined the massive demobilization process. Sailors were reassigned or discharged as the German submarine force was rapidly disbanded under the terms of defeat. The armistice required Germany to surrender its entire submarine fleet to the Allies. U-9 was formally handed over on November 26, 1918 in Harwich, England. While being towed to the scrapyard, she sank near Dover on March 13, 1919. She was later raised and finally broken up for scrap in Morecambe, Lancashire, later that year, bringing the story of U-9 to a quiet close. Armament, evolution, and legacy. When the German U-boat U-9 entered service in 1910, she was armed with 4 17-inch torpedo tubes. 2 were located in the bow and 2 in the stern. In total, she carried 6 C-06 torpedoes. They could travel a distance of 4,920 feet at a speed of 34.5 knots, or 9,840 feet at 26 knots. This configuration placed the main emphasis on submerged torpedo attacks. Initially, there were no deck guns at all, since submarines of this class were designed for coastal defense and quick strikes against large surface ships. At the start of World War I, the armament on U-9 was heavily upgraded. This happened after successful torpedo attacks on British cruisers in September 1914, which showed that the boat needed protection on the surface too. By the end of that year, a 1.5-inch Hotchkiss revolving cannon was installed so the crew could engage merchant vessels and small warships while surfaced. By 1915, the U-boat received a 2-inch gun for increased firepower, as well as a machine gun for close quarters combat and defense against infantry. This allowed U-9 to better adapt to new threats while patrolling and hunting enemy vessels. These changes became part of the broader strategy of the Imperial German Navy, aimed at making early submarines more versatile rather than limiting them strictly to submerged operations. In 1916, during operations in the Baltic Sea, U-9 underwent a temporary experimental modernization. Mine rails were installed so the boat could lay naval mines as an alternative way of fighting in shallow waters. However, this experiment didn't last long. The setup proved unsuccessful for the design of the submarine, and the equipment was removed after the war. The torpedo armament, however, remained unchanged, highlighting the primary role of torpedo strikes in the tactics of U-9. During World War I, the German U-boat U-9 conducted a series of successful patrols, resulting in the confirmed sinking of 18 vessels. These included 4 warships with a total displacement of 43,350 long tons, 13 merchant vessels totaling 8,635 gross register tons, and 1 auxiliary warship of 1,080 gross register tons. The warships were sunk under the command of Otto Wettingen, while the successes against the merchant and auxiliary fleets mostly belonged to Johannes Spies. One notable example among the sunk merchant vessels was the steamer Serbino. Behind the dry numbers lay the harsh realities of service, which demanded perfect coordination from the crew. The gasoline-electric power plant of U-9 strictly divided the rhythm of cruising surfaced and attacking submerged. On the surface, the cording kerosene engines turned the shafts and charged the batteries through generators. As soon as the boat submerged, the combustion engines had to be shut down because the exhaust gases couldn't be safely vented underwater. Then, the electric motors became the sole source of propulsion. And this wasn't just flipping a single lever. The mechanics had to shut down the engines, close the ventilation hatches, check the battery compartments, and trim the boat, while the watch officers maintained constant observation through the periscope. The double hull was meant not only to add structural strength, but also to serve a practical function. Water could be flooded into or pumped out of the ballast tanks located between the pressure hull and the outer casing. This allowed the submarine to control buoyancy without subjecting the crew compartment to external water pressure. The pressure hull itself remained a protected workspace, while the outer hull provided a streamlined shape for moving through the water. However, in stormy weather, this design didn't make life on U-9 comfortable. The small, early-type submarine rolled heavily in the waves, and the narrow internal passageways left almost no room for the sailors to move between the torpedo room, the batteries, the engines, and the control room. For the crew on patrol, navigation was an ongoing task, not just a single calculation before heading out to sea. Coordinates were determined using the compass, distance traveled, coastal landmarks, and sometimes lighthouses or lightships. In the southern part of the North Sea, the flat horizon and frequent fogs made visual navigation highly unreliable. The crew also had to account for currents and wind, which could push the U-boat off its set course. That's why Wettigen's reports constantly mention course corrections and cautious dives. If the U-boat lost its coordinates, it could miss its patrol zone or unexpectedly run aground or into a minefield. How the attack unfolded on September 22nd. This famous battle wasn't a perfectly planned strike from a distance. The U-9 submarine happened upon 3 Cressy-class cruisers in weather that had already disrupted British patrol plans. The cruisers were sailing without their usual destroyer escort because the smaller vessels had been sent to shelter due to a storm. At first, Wettingen observed the group while surfaced, and then submerged for the attack. From about 1,600 feet, a torpedo hit the starboard side of the cruiser Aboukir. The vessel lost speed and began to sink rapidly, while the other 2 cruisers turned toward it to rescue the survivors. This decision to rescue marked the beginning of the second phase of the battle. From periscope depth, Wettingen saw that Hogue and Cressy had stopped or were moving slowly near the stricken vessel. U-9 fired a torpedo at the cruiser Hogue and scored a direct hit right in the center section. When Cressy opened fire, the bow of the U-boat momentarily rose almost to the surface and was spotted, but U-9 managed to escape by submerging again. The final attack required patience rather than a single lightning-fast shot. The U-boat maneuvered around the wreckage and fired at Cressy from a new position. British reports from the time note that one torpedo missed the stern, while the next two hit the target. Ultimately, the cruiser Cressy capsized and sank at about 7:55 in the morning. The scale of U-9's success was amplified by who her opponents were. Aboukir, Hogue, and Cressy were large, pre-dreadnought armored cruisers, but they weren't built to defend against a coordinated torpedo attack from an unseen submarine. Their destruction proved that armor no longer guaranteed safety below the waterline. After this, British command began to emphasize destroyer escorts, zigzagging, and maintaining a constant speed during patrols. The attack on the cruiser Hawke on October 15th proved another important point. The U-9 submarine didn't need to destroy an entire squadron to influence the course of the war. A single, isolated vessel was enough. Hawke was struck when it separated from the rest of its group, and due to rapid flooding, the crew had almost no time for an organized response. Following these events, British anti-submarine methods began to evolve rapidly, but in 1914, detection technologies still remained primitive. The small size of U-9 and its ability to hide beneath the waves made this U-boat an incredibly difficult target. From public sensation to training vessel Weddigen's victories turned U-9 into a true symbol, but the subsequent service of this U-boat was much less spectacular. As soon as newer submarines entered service with greater range, more powerful batteries, and more reliable diesel engines, the early gasoline-electric design became too expensive to maintain and vulnerable during long patrols. In the Baltic Sea, U-9 could still be useful, as the distances there were shorter and the narrow waters required careful reconnaissance. However, this same geography increased the danger of mines and made every navigational error much more critical. The failed attempt to convert this vessel for mine laying perfectly shows the limits of what's possible when trying to adapt an old hull to new tasks. Installing the rails was doable, but the internal layout, balance, and handling of a submarine designed specifically for torpedoes just weren't suited for carrying and dropping mines. So the most logical decision was to return the boat to training duty. In the city of Kiel, new recruits aboard U-9 learned the basics that were the same for every U-boat. This included preparing to dive, maintaining trim, monitoring battery charge, handling torpedoes, and surfacing safely after emergencies.